at least threaten to say to pull out. That's totally within the realm of possibility, and the average American doesn't care. People have opinions. We have in these social media rooms, but people don't. It's not as important to the American people because it doesn't affect us. It's not as important to us as it is to them.
That's a good point. I kind of agree with that on some level. I don't think your average American, and it's not that we don't care about the lives lost, but I think many of us understand politically how this political game works and how wars are profitable for many leaders. No doubt, likely profitable for our government. And because this war doesn't seemingly directly impact your average American, I'm with Rob on this. I wonder how much the average American actually cares about this war.
Hold on, let me just jump in real quick. I don't think it's whether they care or not. It's the fact that we're divided in people. There seems to be thirds. There's that third that is going to support Trump no matter what he does. There's the third that really doesn't care and fits into that category. But then there's also a third that no matter what Trump does, they're going to criticize every move he makes. And I think anything he does, he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. If they can weaponize something against Trump, I think they will. And so I think you do have to be careful the decisions he makes because you've got enemies that are committed to trying to take him down, right, wrong, or indifferent. I mean, you got to remember, they tried to keep him off the ballot, they tried to throw him in jail, and they tried to kill him. You think they're not going to criticize his decisions on war and peace?
Well, I won't jump into that combo, Mojo, and it's your room, but just speaking of your thirds, I think, to that point, I think Anson has great experience and things like that. I just, respectfully, obviously, I don't think that the people care. I think that it's something to talk about, but people are not going to take to the streets about Ukraine. People in political circles will get on TV and social media and et cetera. The interested regular people will have something to talk about, but it's a nothing burger. Now, what will turn people out in the streets? Israel and Gaza. That can literally not tear the country apart, but it can definitely have an effect, seriously. But the Ukraine and Russia, nobody. It's not that big of a deal to Americans like that, for real.
So I just wanted to jump in here. You brought up a poll that you read, and I'm assuming it's the Gallup poll from August. That's generally the one that I hear people cite often. I would be careful about this sentiment because, again, the desertion rates that, like any reporting out of Ukraine, you have to take with a grain of salt. It's like believing China's economic numbers when they cite things. It's just like, okay. I would say that a lot of those polls seem to be targeted, even those that are on the other side want a piece. But I do hear from more and more representatives, particularly in the UN, who are bringing this up, that they are citing and saying we need a quicker resolution to the end of the war. And I think Ukrainian sentiment right now, with the way that you have the AWOL rates going on in Ukraine, you have people fleeing the battlefield, there's not this overwhelming narrative to rush out there and defend the homeland. And I think that's, like, if I look at those numbers and I look at some of that reporting, and then I take into account, like, what we have in the U.S. or Europe and say, oh, there's high support for Ukraine. No, I don't think the people there they're just sick and tired of it. They don't want to be bombed anymore. They don't want to see their relatives come back. That there isn't this world push that Ukraine, that I think many people tried to get for that. And I just, the way the numbers are, and the number of people that are citing refugee status, the numbers that are fleeing into Europe, that's actually causing consternation in those areas, I think is now more prevalent that more than half of the country is now at a point where they just want it all to stop. They don't care what the outcome is at this point. They just want it to stop.
Marshall, do you have anything you want to say? Can you bring anything over from what the sentiments might be over in the critical thinking forum. I mean, we're kind of stuck here between the practical side and the moral side. You got anything to add to this conversation? Marshall?
Sorry, Anson, I didn't hear you. Say again.
Do you have anything? We're kind of stuck between the moral imperative of don't give them an inch and drive Russia back to the pre-2014 boundaries, and the practical side that there's no way in hell to do that unless NATO puts massive boots on the ground and we essentially go to war with Russia. So we seem to be, and there's the other option that's been suggested that to hell with it, the U.S. pulls clear and stops supplying anything to anybody to continue to fight the war. And what insights can you bring over from the critical thinking forum, or are they just stuck on the moral ground and we're going to continue to fight until hell freezes over and Russia gives up?
They're stuck on the moral piece. There was a commenter from Scotland, a guy named Paul, who made the point that most of the time countries in history take land through conquest, and the person with the bigger stick ends up governing. I am very much in your camp when it comes to Ukraine, which is we're no longer Ronald Reagan's military. We have to pick and choose where we put our resources. China is a much bigger threat overall than Russia is. Russia is still a near-peer competitor as defense estimates rank it. But I think we need to focus on our main peer competitor, not the second-tier competitor. While I think supplying these folks with weapons through the Europeans is probably a decent idea, we're not going to go to war. There's not an appetite for that in the United States. And so we're essentially stuck between having a long, drawn-out meat grinder like Korea and just letting it all go. I think the meat grinder probably takes more Russian lives in the invasion, but that's what happens with meat grinders. They take lives on each side. So for me, sitting in the middle of this, my overall conclusion is, look, if we can, help supply the Europeans with weapons and the Europeans give those to the Ukrainians, that's absolutely fine with me. But if people want the United States to step in so we can roll things back to pre-2014, that's not a place in the United States to get involved. And in fact, that's just what China would be hoping. That we would tie ourselves down and get another quagmire and not be able to focus on our near-peer competitor. And so I think we have to keep, in terms of U.S. grand strategy and national interest, I think we have to keep our eyes on the ball. And eyes on the ball means dealing with China more than it means dealing with Russia.
But you don't think that giving those resources and
You said it again, so you're going to be cut out.
yeah, you're cutting out.
Maybe she's having a problem with the mute button.
Maybe she's in a glitch.
Oh yeah, she'll be right back. Her app was glitching. But yes, that's my general take. It seems like it is within the interest of the U.S. to be minorly involved, but not majorly involved. Supplying weapons seems like something that only would drag on the war. It wouldn't lead to a decisive end. So maybe we don't want to do that because it, again, puts Russia in a meat grinder. Although there does seem to be a strategic piece, which is if we put Russia in a meat grinder, the Russia-China Defense Pact has a harder time operating because the Russians are tied down in Ukraine. And they may not have either energy or military resources to redevote to helping China with its defensive strategy in Southeast Asia. Having said that, I had been on this kind of train for the last several years, which is we need a bigger U.S. Navy. We need a bigger U.S. Navy. We need more ships. We need more people. China's going to be a 400-ship Navy in 2039 or 2040. And while it takes time to gain the expertise to become a blue water Navy and become proficient at it, the inability of the American public or the American government to adequately recognize that we need to bulk up our Navy is a problem. We also have to deal with the Jones Act, which requires a lot of stuff to be manufactured domestically, a lot of ships to be manufactured domestically, which I think having a domestic manufacturing base is really important. But in the short term, why don't we look at like buying destroyers from South Korea or Japan and make fairly decent destroyers, as I understand it, and that would help us push off some space in which to get our domestic manufacturing house back in order. Because at least as I understand it, the Navy is supposed to get something like 15 ships a year, and they'll only be getting 5. So for folks who don't understand why I'm focusing on the U.S. Navy, from San Diego to Seoul, South Korea is 6,000 miles. From San Diego to Diego Garcia, which goes through the South China Sea into Indonesia and the Malacca Straits, and then out into the Indian Ocean to Diego Garcia U.S. Naval Base is 11,000 miles. So we can't be on the other side of the world at the snap of a finger. We have to be able to forward deploy, and forward deploying means we have to be able to put ships out there, and it doesn't really help if we're putting the ships out past their service time or what they should normally be out of the water on before they come back to the port to get the needed repairs. That's why I'm really focused on the Navy in that way, because it's such a long distance that you can't do anything without an adequately functioning Navy. And I think we do still largely have an adequately functioning Navy, but the inability to get those ships when we need them is a severe problem for the United States.
Okay, I have a question for you, Marshall.
Yes, please, go ahead.
So I know you essentially compared Russia as basically a 2-tier problem comparatively to China being our closest competitor that we need to be more concerned with. But don't you think that, like, if we stand back and we cede to Russia keeping the land that they're currently occupying, doesn't that give them like control of all of those resources over there and the Black Sea control as well? I mean, wouldn't that be bound to shift things for them if we just, negotiated to give them the land that they're occupying right now?
I mean, look, I worry that giving them the land will only involve Vladimir Putin's want to roll into the rest of Eastern Europe and put the USSR back together.
Right.
However, having said that, we have to take what is principal and important against what we can practically do. My ranking of China ahead of Russia comes from the National Defense Estimate, which is something put together by our defense community and the different multilateral intelligence agencies. And one of the things that allowed China to bump up as quick as it has, for example, was us being tied down in the quagmire of Iraq. Right, that allowed us to focus our attention on the Middle East, while China focused their attention on Africa and doing trade there and doing debt swap deals in which they'll build some ports and roads, but if you can't pay back for it, the Chinese government then owns it. So while I do think there's an imperative to tell Vladimir Putin, no, you can't have this stuff, China's always going to come in the number 1 position in the defense estimate, and Russia's always going to come in the number 2 position. Or at least it's been that way for most of my lifetime, I should say. Having said all of that, I could wave my fingers, and we could make sure that Vladimir Putin did not take the rest of parts of Ukraine. I would do that. But as Anson, I think, has properly pointed out, the ability to have anything other than a meat grinder in Ukraine is dependent upon putting troops on the ground to fight the Russians. And if the Europeans get involved fighting the Russians on the ground, it could draw the United States into that, which is, as I said earlier, nobody in the United States wants to go to war again. They're just not interested. And also, if the Europeans want to get involved that way, I don't necessarily see a problem with the Europeans doing the European thing, right? Like, it's territory that's closer to them than it is to us. But if the United States were to get involved and have to put, the 82nd Airborne on the ground in Ukraine, we would get tied down in a way that would not allow us to then turn our attention to our first near-peer competitor. Essentially, we're in between this idea that ideologically we might want not one more ranch. Practically, we don't have the resources or the public support to ensure that, right? We have the public support to ensure buildup of U.S. Navy to confront China, but we don't have a popular idea that submitting U.S. troops on the ground would be a good idea. So I think in answer to your question, as much as I would like to stop them from giving one more inch, I think the best we're going to get out of this is some sort of a meat grinder like Korea. And it's still within U.S. national interest to have the Russians grind themselves up in the meat grinder, right? But it may not be within our national interest right away to help put troops on the ground or to spend, 1/9 of the defense budget on the Ukraine war. I say all of that because the defense estimates rank our most important adversary as China, and as I said, Russia always comes in as a number 2 in the modern world. So I always tend to go for practical over ideological, because that's the real world. If we let ourselves live by our ideology, then we're going to be pursuing things in a way that is hopeful but not practical, right?
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, hopefully that helps.
So I just wanted to chime in on something you said, Marshall. Ordering ships from Korea, I'll let Captain speak to that a little bit because he knows more about the subs and some of those. But you would never pay someone like me to go on a Korean-made destroyer. The best they can produce with our Aegis class weapon systems is probably comparable to the Arleigh Burke class destroyers that we have. And most of the world kind of falls either just beneath that or on par with them. They're nowhere near as well class destroyers. As a destroyer man myself, I love my little boats. I think they're fantastic. However, scaling up to say 5 destroyers every couple of years from South Korea, would severely impact their resources. They wouldn't be able to meet the demands right off the bat. Secondly, when we talk about shipbuilding, U.S. Navy ships, just to give you a record, we test them. We actually do explosives. We run them through the gamut. Like, you have to have shockproof pumps from impacts. Think the USS Cole, for instance, had a hole in its side and it still stayed afloat. Our ships are designed in such a way to actually absorb impacts or take an impact and still function. It takes a lot to sink a U.S. Navy ship. Korea does make a good boat. However, they're not comparable to ours. They're about 10% larger in capacity, the last records that I looked at. But it's a little bit bigger in certain areas. Some designs are nice, but it's more of a commercial marketing rather than a tactical or actual nautical marketing. Our ships have a lot of other things that we adapt that came from us, like most specifically World War II. We learned a lot in shipbuilding in terms of making our ships. Now, we've made mistakes trying to do more advances than other things, but I would not say that Korea could supplant a U.S. Navy ship. Also, not to mention the fact that China would take drones. Watch that. That's a little bit too close to home. You'd have Russia doing the same thing, and they would gain tactical advantages watching these in the shipyards being built over a few years. Sorry.
Let me intervene here. We're getting off topic. It's a great topic. How do we rebuild our defense establishment so that we can go one-on-one with China in the modern world. But the topic of the room is about Ukraine, peace, giving up land, and so forth. And I want to see if I can, and Brad has brought up a good point that he thinks Russia is going to wear down in a meat grinder faster than Ukraine, maybe. So let's talk about Friday night after Trump and Putin have their session. Would it be in the best interest of the United States and NATO and Ukraine if Putin refuses to give an inch and Trump recognizes that, he walks out of the room and says, we're going to keep fighting, but we're going to keep fighting with the U.S. providing arms to Europe, which Europe buys and then gives to Ukraine. We're going to continue the meat grinder, and we're going to wait and see which side wears down faster and sues for unilateral peace, maybe not unconditional surrender, but which side is going to surrender first. Is that the best it could come out of this session with Putin this coming Friday?
If I could jump in, is it the best scenario? No, right? Is it the most likely and the most probable? Yeah. Unless, as I mentioned before,
what is the best scenario, Rob?
the best scenario is they find a way to make a deal and cut it out, right? The best scenario is they find a way, Donald Trump understanding, for lack of a better term, the strongman ethos, right? Let me give you cover to save face in front of your people. Not that he necessarily cares, but Putin cares about his image. He, as Frank mentioned in the chat, he controls the narrative that the Russian people will get, and he doesn't care, right? He doesn't care about that. He does care about his image. So if he has cover to lack of a better term, to retreat, right, and still call it a win, he'll take it, right? And Ukraine could say the same thing, right? Ukraine, I believe, just wants the war to stop and leave us alone, that kind of situation. But Russia needs to save face. That's the best scenario to come out of this meeting. That's the best scenario. Is it the most likely? No, but it is the best.
But you agree that Ukraine has to cede significant land to Russia in order to achieve that outcome this Friday, right?
From a pragmatic perspective, they have to give up something. Yeah, they have to give Russia a reason to want to say, "I'll stop." Right? I don't think that he will. I don't think he's not incentivized to do so. The only incentive for Zelensky to do that is if the United States, vis-a-vis NATO, says we're done. We don't have the capacity anymore. We don't have we can't. I'm not going to do it. Right? If the United States says that, then Ukraine doesn't have the prerogative, and they'll try to cut the best deal that they can, even if that means giving up some land. But if the United States stays in it, stays funding NATO, stays giving intelligence, stays giving weapons and money and things like that, we could say we could last as long as the United States can last, which we assume to be forever, right? And Russia's going to say, well, I'm going to stay in it too, you know. That's also a very real possibility. I defer to Marshall. He's a little smarter than me in these kinds of things, but from my experience, the most probable scenario is that it just keeps going on. I think the most probable scenario is nothing changes. They had a good fucking talk. They had something to eat, and it stays the same. I think that's the most probable, unfortunately.
Are you asking like how to win while getting a peace at some point, Captain?
No, I'm not. I'm basically going to rely on your position that Russia's losing the war faster than Ukraine is, and we keep the pressure on through current sanctions, more sanctions, continuing to resupply Ukraine vis-a-vis Europe so it doesn't cost us any money, In other words, that is that the best way to go in the best interest of the United States this coming weekend? Do you think it is? I think that was your position, that Putin's going to lose this faster than Ukraine is, so let's keep the pressure on and let's wait and see what happens in the future, right?
That's only if U.S. and European forces, NATO overall, and maybe India and South Korea, if these countries come to some agreement to supply Ukraine. India is going to stay in the middle road. They don't want any part of it. South Korea has been supplying their weapons. NATO is like, it's just a whole mess there, sir. So I would say unless Trump is going to lead the front, and again, we're right back at square one where we're going to do funding, and it depends on how fast that aid would get to Ukraine. I think if you dropped massive amounts of aid, and I mean military weapons to Ukraine, could they rally and actually push Russia? Most likely, most definitely. If you gave them the right systems, you gave them the right air support, and the U.S. said, you know what, hell with this, we're just going to put a blockade in the Black Sea. Good luck, Russia. Let's see what you got. And did a combined NATO force in there, then actually sanctions the shit out of Russia, sir. I think you'd have a winning strategy. Also, if I was Zelensky, I would be funneling, low-tiered explosives, weapons to the centers in Russia, saying, blow up spaces. Some of you may not like that. I would orchestrate that. I would say, this is for my nation. I'm going to hit your hard spots. I'm going to get the people so upset with you that they're going to say, hey, we need to stop this. And I'm going to hit soft targets, and I'm going to hit areas where it'll have economic impact as well as optics impact. I'm one that says the rules of war can be changed. I would also say, if everybody was serious about it, Putin is this evil guy. Well, if I was Zelensky, I would probably try to orchestrate a team to assassinate him. I would just do that. I mean, what are they going to do? Hold him as a war criminal? No one's called for that yet. I mean, some Republicans will, some MAGA types will, some on the left will, but no one's going to really do anything against Zelensky.
So again, summarizing, if I may, Brad says keep fighting, and keep fighting harder than the current status quo. And the only thing I would suggest that is a problem with that is if we stay in the position of we're continuing to use our military-industrial complex to provide the bulk of the material to sell to Ukraine, I don't think our military-industrial complex at this point can keep up with the war. I think that we are scraping the bottom of the barrel to produce enough weapons right now just to keep Ukraine supplied. Can we fight harder from the United States, not by putting boots on the ground, but by giving them better and more weapons? I think that's going to be a huge challenge, and it's going to be a very expensive one.
May I ask a sort of an elementary question?
Sure, go ahead.
Do we know why we're supporting Ukraine, and say that the U.S. and European partners, allies, are supporting Ukraine? Do we understand why we're doing that?
I think we do. We're supporting them because Vladimir Putin has decided to break the agreement post-World War II, which is that countries don't wantonly take other countries' land, despite the fact that Putin considers it a buffer zone.
Okay, so we're funding a war to enforce rules or guidelines.
We'll see. I believe that the United States has been doing this based on moral principles that, since World War II, if you invade another country, that's wrong, and you're not going to get any land in doing so. And that's the moral position that the United States has taken. I agree with that position, by the way, but we're certainly unable to enforce it in Ukraine for the last 4 years. Actually 10 years if you start back in 2014.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's noble. I think oftentimes wars aren't over morality.
He doesn't have anybody
more often
anymore
they're over
like he had the first time around.
So,
he did have some people.
I think it's my perspective that is maybe not well understood by the general public, that the resources, or more specifically, the land that Putin has occupied and now occupies, how resource rich and important those resources are to the energy security of our greatest allies in Europe, and how that if those resources were to go into the hands of Russia, they further their monopoly on both oil and natural gas. And if you've ever been a consumer in a monopoly, it's very difficult. It's untenable, and there are few ways out. So I'd say that as long as people have a greater understanding that we're providing support to the Ukrainians, and I hope to some degree European partners are as well, they certainly need to step up their game.
They did not say, well, let us bring in, some community leaders.
The energy needs of Europe, and therefore trade amongst the world as it is today, depends on us not giving up that land. Not because of lives or relations, but because of resources, which is the basis of most conflict in the world. It's over resources.
We've got a new guy on the stage that I don't know how, Rockville, I don't know how long you've been listening, but we're really wrestling with this problem, and I wonder if you've got any insights as to cessation of land, what's going to happen, what should happen on Friday, etc. You want to contribute your insight?
Thank you, Hanson. Listen, I can talk way too much. I'm going to try and be incredibly brief. There are two ways that countries lose wars, militarily and then politically. And to focus in on that, I'll give you two examples. At the end of the Second World War, the Germans lost that war militarily, i.e. the Allies, the Russians, went all the way to Berlin. The Germans could not put another army in the field, defeated militarily. If you look at Vietnam, America lost that war politically. So the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, did not go all the way to Washington to defeat the United States. But the United States just said, this is costing us too much to keep prosecuting this war. We're getting nowhere. So if you understand the way that wars are lost, militarily, and then also politically, it then kind of informs what is going on with Russia and Ukraine. So if we look at this, it's an asymmetric war, i.e. the Russians actually could wipe the Ukrainians out tomorrow by dropping nuclear bombs. They're not going to do that because it'd be the end of the world. And even if they did a relatively small nuclear strike, the whole world would turn against them. It'd be such a ratcheting up. But on paper, it's an asymmetrical fight. So what are they actually fighting for? The Russians thought they could knock the Ukrainians out of the field militarily by going all the way to Kiev, having a regime change, and then they could then take the land in the east, which is exactly actually what they've done. However, the Ukrainians were fighting to defend their land and hoping that at some point the cost would be too high for the Russians. The fact of the matter is that from a Western perspective, we don't know when civil society will collapse in Russia, i.e. the institutions away from the state will just say, this is too expensive a fight. Somebody said on this stage that 1 million Russians there have been 1 million Russian casualties. That appears to be the Western consensus. We don't really know, but it appears to be the consensus. And if you look at when Russia fought the war in Afghanistan, it was much less Russian casualties, which then caused Russian mothers to complain and to demonstrate in Moscow, St. Petersburg, etc., and say we need to bring our boys home. but Putin has a much more iron grip on Russian society and the political apparatus than Gorbachev did at the end of the Soviet Union. So, rationally, the Ukrainians are going to have to give up some land regardless. Crimea is gone. The West has tacitly admitted that since 2014. That's gone. It ain't ever coming back in a plausible scenario. If you look at a map, it's a quiet secret here. If you look at a map of the formation of the Ukraine when it was part of the Soviet Union in 1922-24, those eastern bits which the Russians wanted to have occupied were not part of the new state of Ukraine, the Soviet state of Ukraine. Actually, what the Russians have done is literally got all of their war aims, apart from having an acquiescent regime in Kiev. So, what are the Ukrainians